Today's webinar is a rebroadcast of an AIHA webinar that was recorded on February 10th. Both joined us live today, and they will answer your questions via chat during this broadcast. They will all participate in a live Q&A at the end of the presentation. I will begin the rebroadcast.
Welcome to today's webinar, Tips to Ensure Compliance with OSHA's Alignment with GHS Chemical Classification and Labeling. I'm Alki, Editor-in-Chief of The Synergist, the magazine of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. I'd like to thank listeners for attending today's event, and especially to Biovia for sponsoring this webinar. The Association Biovia provides a scientific, collaborative environment for advanced biological, chemical, and materials experiences. The Biochemical Inventory Management System enables organizations to manage chemicals safely from receipt to disposal along the entire lab-to-plant value chain, ensure environmental health and safety compliance across the enterprise. Dan Sefried, a pre-sales field applications engineer for Biovia, who uses her application expertise to help organizations optimize their chemical inventory management activities, and graduated from Chapman University with a BS in Computer Information Systems. Also, Denese, Denese co-founder and senior consultant at Industrial Health and Safety Consultants in Shelton, Connecticut. She's a certified industrial hygienist and has previously served on the board of directors of the Society for Chemical Hazard Communication. She'll not be presenting today, but is on the panel to help answer specific technical questions about GHS and OSHA's hazard communication standard. And over to Ann.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Let me go ahead and advance this here. Just high-level overview of what we'll be covering, a quick introduction to the GHS, as well as a little bit about the OSHA standard and how that applies here of chemical inventory management. First, then we'll talk a little bit about the challenges people face with chemical inventory management, also SDS management, because both of those things are directly affected when it comes to GHS and the changes that are being adopted. And we're sharing some tips to ensure compliance, how we've been able to assist customers in adopting the changes that are coming down with. So one of the things, and trying to keep this very basic and understanding, we really appreciate having Denise on the line. My background is not with, it is just providing a basic understanding, what is GHS, and really with an Globally Harmonized System of classification and labeling of chemicals. Very basic, but the point is, the UN went out and really looked at ways that people classifying materials, not just in one region or one location, but around the world, and they determined that there's a difference that really wanted to overcome, and in doing so, they wanted to come up with a system that came up with GHS. A logical question of, what is that? Really, it comes down to a logical and comprehensive approach to three primary things: physical and environmental hazards. So really looking at chemicals, and if you were to take a step and think about life on a day-to-day basis, chemicals really are in every part of day-to-day life, not just in workplaces, but everywhere. And so being able to look at those materials and define, are they flammable? Are they toxic? They cause cancer leaked into a river or stream. So a kind of approach to defining what those hazards are. Importantly, being able to create classifications based on existing data. And what it means is looking at not just how we hear materials, how they're classified around the world, and coming up with a criteria so that we don't classify them the same. An example, if I was talking about butane, it's a highly flammable material. know that. Here in the U.S., we use the Hazardous Materials Identification System, also known as HMIS. It really looks at a couple key characteristics, things like flash point and vapor pressures. But the goal is that's a US-based classing system so that when we look at butane, we know it's highly flammable. Rating of 4, for example, versus a 0, which represents something that wouldn't burn. So that's how we do it, but it's done differently around the world. Everybody has their own different types of classifications. So with GHS, the goal is to come up with common criteria to help find those hazards. And of course, the last thing, which is very important, is after we find the hazards based on common criteria, we'll communicate it effectively through labeling, where we're shipping materials, we're storing them, we're disposing them, as well as creating SDSs, so data sheets that have all the information that a person needs to ensure that they're handling that chemical state, they're storing it correctly, they're using it correctly. Basic questions about why. Why are we doing this? A little image here, which kind of, I think, in a big picture, kind of explains it. If we were to get hazards and the way it's classified today, there's a lot of different images, there's a lot of different classifications. And if you look at the world trade today, there's a huge amount of chemicals that are changing hands and crossing lines, and there's no way to understand if a flame rating of 4 in an NFPA diamond is equivalent to a square box of a flame in it. There's a lot of difference out there. So there's this huge disconnect in how we classify those materials. So basically, a lot of information that's in the GHS. There's this one part that really jumped out at me in just simplifying it, and it's really this middle paragraph here. Through variations and definitions of hazards, a chemical may be considered flammable in one country, but not another. Or cause cancer in one country, but not another. The goal, if you look at the big picture, as we continue to grow, trade becomes easier, communication, we need to ensure it's all streamlined. We want to make sure that if I order something from across the ocean and it comes in, I can look at it and know exactly what the hazards are, and not what the hazards are, how someone else based it, but based on the same criteria. And it's just very important to have everybody on the same page and then be able to easily translate it and communicate that information regardless of where you're located or where that material is being manufactured. Some just regarding, understand that the reason we're doing this is because the adverse effects of chemicals on people in the environment, the world, just kind of here to chop it down. Many countries and organizations have lots of different laws, regulations regarding how we classify, how we communicate that information, significant gap. So between the way that everybody does that, how they classify it, how they communicate, there's a big enough difference that makes it difficult to share information, to pass chemicals and be able to use them. In some countries, when you think about how difficult this is, and there's a lot of things that go into classifying materials when you think about how many unique products there are out in the world, as well as new things being produced all the time, a lot of these don't even have a system in place. It's just too overwhelming. All of that and the extent level of global trade today, there's a basic need that GHS is going to try to overcome. The goal is to have that in place to classify the materials correctly, that we can ensure safe use, transportation, disposal, the way that it's understood internationally. So I just screenshot out of there, just really highlighting the same things. The goal, if GHS is successful, is to really enhance protection of human health and the environment by providing that comprehensive system that I've been talking about. Also providing a framework. So for countries that don't have the ability to have these large organizations that go out there and have, build these criteria, we can provide it. Here's the criteria. If a material has this flammability rating or this flash or it's cost, you can easily identify that without having your own system in place. Of course, reduces the need. So if I have the same material and you have it, we already know what the criteria is. We know how to classify it. It's going to reduce the need for testing and evaluation of materials because it's already been done and we can share that common information, which of course helps facilitate international trade of chemicals because everything's already identified and we can easily understand what those questions are. That really to the second point, which is how OSHA is going to change and how the change affects us. So there's two things, there's a lot of different information, a lot of little things that's mixed in, but if you were to look at the two biggest things, is or has modified the HAZCOM standard in 2012 to align with the UN's GHS. The goal, as already mentioned, is to have a comprehensive and stable approach to the classification of hazards and how to convey information with a primary goal here in the U.S. of having the safest working environment possible. So there's two things we're talking about: the standardization of label elements by hazard class and category, as well as the standardized order of information in the data sheet. So in some of these things, it's not a lot of different information, but if we're changing the criteria, what determines things to be hazardous, there may be changes in a material that we know as a certain classification. We look at the new regulation, it might change. We might need to change options. We might need to update our labels. We might need to rewrite some of the content in our SDSs. Really things, as I mentioned early, it's the enhancement of both employer and the workers' comprehension. Again, out there, and there's lots of different classifications. There's all those different pictograms. There's different signals. There's different reading systems. What we want to do is ensure that the employers and the workers that are being exposed to these materials know how to properly handle them. They're using things safely. Is it in a fume hood? Does it need to be closed at all times? How does this material need to be used? What does it need to stay away from? And of course, the second part is being able to enable workers and emergency response personnel quick and efficient access to the information. So, the difficulties is if we have, everyone's looked at SDSs before, and they're in different formats, and some information and everyone has different information. And if every time you open one, you dig around and figure out, what the classification is, that could be a problem in an emergency. So applications, so that from a labeling perspective, it's easy to understand what the hazards are, and the same thing with an SDS. If I need to find out, what I need to do, it's easy to open up and know I need to go to section 6, because all of them are going to be formatted the same. Which, of course, we envision from a name perspective, dropping the N, so from mature data sheets, they're referring to them as safety sheets. And then, of course, hard thing, which both of them are pretty difficult to transition to, will be the labeling. What this part has to do with is manufacturing, being able to reclassify the materials. We're going to use new pictograms. They're red, they're bright, they're easy to see, and everyone will be responsible for having key elements, like the product identifier. What is it? A signal, whether it's a warning or a danger, the hazard statements, the primary statements, as well as the identification and a reference to the safety data sheet for additional information. So what we see from an end user's perspective is, as we're receiving new materials, they start having the new GHS appropriate labels on them. So that's a manufacturing requirement. Which leads into how does that affect the lab, affect chemical inventory management, and of course labeling. A large convention with our company, talking about not just chemical inventory, but electronic lab notebooks. We talked about LIMS. We talked about experimental knowledge base. We talked about all these different systems out there in the lab used to collect data. We found over time was this term dark data. There's things that we don't know. And we don't know is because you don't have a single source for collecting that information. Different information is collected. If you and I are both doing chemical inventory in our lab, I'm using an Excel spreadsheet, you're using a manual log, I'm tracking 10 fields, you're tracking 3. There's different content, and there's no easy way to access it. We have different workflows. Everything's disconnected, and when you have disconnected information, there's no need to update the information. It's very time-consuming if you were to have to go out and try to combine that content into a single form. So it's very challenging when you don't actually have a system in place to manage that. In a visual perspective, even with an Excel spreadsheet, if I have an Excel spreadsheet and the person in the lab next to me has one, if we don't have a common format, I'll be tracking the name, AIS number, and maybe a total quantity for all the acetone I have in my lab. Whereas the guy next door might be tracking the name, the flammability rating, and a formula, and an amount for each container. So it's varied information. And then you still have it where we go into labs and, the most effective way they teach you manage chemicals today is the old-fashioned handwritten log. The container comes in, I write information in, it just takes me a few minutes, it's pretty efficient, write it down. The problem is in emergency situations, how do we know what's actually there? That's a very time-consuming method to try to go through and extract data. And I drew a screenshot here just of an older system for use to track information. But again, if I have a system here and on the same campus, maybe in a different building, someone's using Excel, again, they're disconnected. So it's dark data. There's no way to actually capture all of these things, combine them together. What leads into GHS is really having a system that's outdated. Whether it's the logs or the Excel files, or even I just grabbed a screenshot of one of our legacy systems. Great, so we still have people using it today. The problem is it's outdated. There's no field for GHS content. So as we move forward, part of the OSHA initiative is to train our users. Because if you don't relabel your inventory, but the new stuff coming in will have the new labels. So the responsibility is to make sure that all of the employees and the workers understand what the new classifications are. So from a perspective, if I'm using a solution that doesn't allow me to track that new information, it's very hard to adopt it. It's very hard when you can't see it side by side. This is my NFPA values, my fire code classifications. This is new GHS. There's lack of support for changes. If you're using a legacy system, you look at the fact that, do you have a development group behind it? Are they able to make those changes to allow you to move forward, to grow as OSHA adopts these changes? Of course, that leads to problems with duplicate sources for updating. If I have an Excel spreadsheet and you have a system, neither of our systems allows to track the GHS content, then actually going to try it in, but it's going to be manual. It's not going to be actually correct or right format, and we're both doing the work possibly for the same chemicals. And the bullet item there really comes down to printed color labels. I've worked with Biovia for the past 10 years, and up until this point, there's never been a need. In all of the chemical inventory systems we've sold and supported, people are able to print white, keep labels so they're chemical resistant. They can sit in containers, they don't get ruined, but there was a need to put color labels on. But with GHS and the way that OSHA is adopting it, you are required to have the red diamond. So in the situations where I'm dispensing to a secondary container or something happened, I want to relabel it, I need to be able to not only print a label with the hazards, but be able to include that color. So that does represent a challenge in terms of chemical inventory management. So some of the chemical challenges, really all the stuff that exists today, as long as it's labeled, as long as those labels align with GHS, they don't have to be relabeled. It's not an undertaking that you have to take. You can if you want to, but it's not a requirement. You've got to understand that the new inventory coming in, manufacturers are required to produce those labels. So you're going to have a difference between what's coming in and what's already there. So people need to understand the differences and be able to read and understand both types of classifications with training. And I just threw the diagram. I think I saw someone actually already posted a quite on this, but one of the big differences when we talk about color, it's very easy. Kind of all of us know that red is usually something bad. It tells us to stop when we're at light. It tells us, if we look at Department of Homeland Security, they've got these different ratings. If we're at red, there's an imminent threat, for example. And it's the same thing with HMIS and the new GHS. But what's different is they actually changed it. So when you're looking at an HMIS or an NFPA level with red, if I'm looking at the 4, that means it's extremely hazardous, it's extremely flammable. But GHS, it's completely the opposite. The red still means hazardous, but what represents to what extent. So it'd be very confusing to have both systems in place, and you'll do that as long as you just make sure everybody has the appropriate training, they understand the differences and how they apply. This leads us to SDS Management Challenges, which can be just as difficult as the chemical inventory management. Here, that's probably tasked with looking at the SDSs and figuring out how we're going to tackle this problem. Unique challenges when we think about inventory management is the fact that we also need to track SDSs. About R&D specifically, we're usually talking about a high volume of unique materials. So instead of having, being like a garage and having 10 chemicals, I've got my oil and I've got some lubricant, I've got a couple different things, I've got 10 things, but lots of each of those. We're research and development, having lots of unique things. I'm going to try this. I order it, I receive it, I test it. It doesn't work, I put it on my shelf. I order, someone else down the hall orders that same thing. So you have a lot of different unique materials, all which may require an SDS. And of course, as you have new things coming on site, if you don't have a system in place, it's very hard to put visibility. What are the new materials? When did they arrive? Do we have the safety data sheet for it? Who has it? How do we find it? And of course, one of the biggest problems and challenges that we run into with all of our customers is limited resource. And someone needs to do it. Safety falls towards the bottom of the list. Lab and ES, they're disconnected. EHS has to make sure we have all these regulations so that we stay in compliance. We have to have the SDSs, but is ES responsible for it? Should it be someone in the lab, someone ordering the material? A lot of times corporate will come down and say, here's the system, use it. Or we want everyone to put things on SharePoint. Or when you get the material in to make it, she's going to keep track of everything for us. All these changes, regulations continue to change, and GHS is a good example. Manufacturers being required to rewrite them, put them into a new format, reclassify the materials if necessary. So it's a huge turnover. And of course, there's a deadline coming, but they're not required to have them until June. So if you're required to have them, it might be a while. So when you shelf and you look at all those binders, it can be a very daunting task. If I have, just a dozen, it might be daunting. But if I have 50,000 or 100,000 or a million unique products, I need those unique SDSs as well. So, not having a way to manage those causes problems. It can be a very difficult process. So if you're to, how does this apply? What do I need to do? Well, we need to ensure that there's a safety data sheet for each material that requires one. Safety data sheet is specific to the product. I know there's been conversations. Sometimes I could just have acetone SDS, and tech it should cover for any of the SDSs or any acetone we have, even from Baker versus Scientific versus Sigma Rich. But you should have the manufacturer-specific SDS for the product that you have on site. And the next bit is you need to ensure that they're current. So we transition to GHS. Know for a fact right now there's going to be a huge turnover. So maybe you have a product that's been in inventory for 10 years. You haven't seen an update in the last 5. If producing that material, you can expect that you should soon be receiving an updated document. And you need to ensure that, as it becomes available, you have a process in place to ensure that you acquire it, you add it to your archives, how we're currently doing that. And of course, the big thing is ensuring that from a safety perspective, when we think about a safe workplace, is making sure that all of the end users, our employees, people have that safety data sheet in case they need it. So I'm a visual person, so if I sum this down, if I'm thinking about it, I've got that guy with my head on the side of the shelf, and I've got all these binders, and I'm thinking about how we're transitioning, and I've got to manually open that binder and start going one by one. Open up, look at the paper file, see what date it is, go online, search for it, see if there's a current one available. If so, download it, print it, or place it in a file. It's a huge daunting task. SharePoint, we've got an electronic system. Everybody uses it. We just up SharePoint. But the question always back in our mind is, how, if SharePoint has an SDS for every material you have in inventory, inventory system, if those two things aren't connected, and of course, again, using just a screenshot from one of our old legacy SDS management systems, there's no content in there. There's not going to be GHS content in there. So again, if you're trying to do the same thing, expect change, you're going to have success. I just, really shortly, you have, a manual process. You have connected process. Very hard to understand what you have in inventory, or manage your SDSs if you don't know what's happening. You have an inventory, and you have and potentially, looking towards the future, it's never going to change. So at some point, we need to look at what we're doing. We need to look at what we can understand. Maybe this is a great system for the last 20 years, but moving forward, we look at a solution that allows us to meet new requirements and continue to grow and have resources behind it. So as more changes come, we can also adopt those. Things that a lot of people don't realize is how much time and effort go into management, which is why you have no resources for this. I use a dollar sign here just because time is money. We all know that we're all worth something. As we sit in an office, as we're working for employees, paying us. So time spent managing something, is money spent. So if I the first guy up here, he represents a person in a lab using a material, let's use butane, and he is responsible for keeping it. Yes, I've got my SDS binder, I've got my document in it. It's to do that. And over time, if I'm responsible for also reviewing and updating it, that's more time. That's more effort. That's more money. What is the fact that I might have my friend down the hall that also uses the same material. But the way corporate set this up is that we're responsible for making our own. So now you have it stored in your binder, I have it stored in my binder. When it's time to update it, you spend time doing that, I spend time doing that, times two. There's a lot of organizations around the world that are looking at a comprehensive way to adopt GHS. Streamline it, they can clean up everything, make sure everything's just clear, crisp, and manage. You've got the guy that's actually in another building. It's not me and you next to each other. It's actually a guy in another building. Okay, that makes sense. We want him to have the SDS over there too. So he has a binder. He spends his time, money. Same material. That is at another state site. In Northern California, we've got a site in New York. We both have the same material. Technically, I have one material from the manufacturer. I have a different document. We're all spending time maintaining, updating, reviewing. So that's a lot of money, a lot of time spent on the same thing. And for this presentation, thinking about, this specifically, because it's a big thing that we run a lot of customers, is how do we get around that? I came across this little image, and it just kind of cracked me up after our worldwide, I think it just sums it all up. Start a task force, eliminate redundancies in our internal processes, thinking about last slide. Really the same thing. Like, okay, off the mark, and sometimes we have great intentions. We get a great system, but we don't look at the big picture. We don't look at, it's not just me and you, it's the guy in the next building. On a bigger scale, we work with a lot of customers that have not just one, they might have 10 sites in the U.S. and then 5 overseas. Look at the big picture. You're going to, as you move forward, there's more and more technologies out there that don't limit you to manage stuff in single silos and having that dark data. There's ways to go out and accomplish everything and do it once so that you can be more effective. You can save people time, give them their time back so they can work on the bench, they can be productive, they can be safe, they can have access to a data sheet, and just more effective overall. One or some of the things that just to kind of take away from here, just to make clear, is that not all inventory requires an SDS. So of course, it's important to understand that within the inventory, there's things that do require it. Those are the ones you need to manage. I've been been on a lot of customers walk through a lot of labs, and there's inventory that we've had that's completely safe, but it's been here since 1862. Maybe it's not. Maybe safety data sheet from back then, or hey, maybe it was before we had safety data sheet, so we don't have one. Well, if it's a discontinued product, you're not going to get a new one. So as GHS comes out, you don't have to write one, you don't have to try to acquire one. There's not going to be one. So understanding that not everything needs an SDS, some will never have one, and that's okay. And all manufacturers are going to be ready for this. You know, there's people frantically out there trying to reclassify all the materials, trying to produce those new documents, but produce thousands of chemicals. This is a huge process, and people are spending a lot of money and a lot of time doing this. So find a way to understand which materials need, identify which ones don't, understand which ones are never going to have an update, understand which manufacturers have not given you an updated document, which leads to how to do that. How do we do that successfully? How do we, in a clear and concise way, what do we have? Which ones are our SDSs? How classified? What are the labels? What are the differentiations between the classifications and the new? Is there anything we need to change? Which is the tips and solutions to help ensure compliance. Time to be most successful is to track inventory in real time. The chicken before the egg and the egg before the chicken, which comes first? Well, if my requirement is to manage a safety data sheet, you need to inventory is to know which you need to track. So if you track your inventory in real time, we know on a day-to-day basis what new comes on site. How we have, of all the things we have, where the stuff is located. A central data repository. So we think electronic, we think easy to access. And when we talk about data, we talked about siloed information, we talked about having access and duplicated effort, about using a system that's easy to access. You define information one time, and that we can reuse it, whether I'm down the hall, across the street, in another state, on the other side of the world, defining information once and putting the data sheet in there once that everybody can access, then you're really saving a lot of time and making people more efficient. Of course, using an electronic system, you can also streamline activities because in all years I've been doing this, you know, chemical inventory management is one of the least things people want to do. It's not my job. I'm a researcher. It's not my job to classify the materials or write and have it or dispose it when we're done. So we want to make sure that that's as streamlined as possible, easy information, and easy access, because we all know it's a task and it's difficult to do, and there's management behind me saying you actually have to do this, I'm not going to do it. So make it easy, an efficient system, and make sure people can share and get that information that they're looking for. In that we've produced, you know, our goal, what we found out a long time ago is that barcoding and management really go hand in hand. You know, because the goal is if I want to have real-time inventory, if I want to be able to effectively understand what the hazards are and have the safety data sheet, you want to track individual container levels so that we know what came in, when it expires, what dispose of it, you know, all those different details, and you track it from receipt to disposal. So a lot of people today, they get it with a thought that once it's here, I wrote it in my log, and then I forget about it. Or receiving, we documented it, but once it goes to the lab, we have no idea. So again, you can safety data sheet for the next 15 years for stuff we don't even have in inventory. So it's a really big benefit of putting a barcode on it, tracking it, so that if it's still out there, we know we need to keep managing it. If it's not, we can then stop managing that document. Don't waste time on stuff that you don't need to do. Another key is, you know, when you're doing this, define it once, identify hazards, set up the material correctly, associate the safety data sheet, retain. I put a couple examples of labels down here just to kind of understand that there's a significant difference between inventory labels and labels. So from an inventory standpoint, we want to know what we have. We want to track it from receipts and disposal. We can do that through barcoding, putting a barcode scan on it, scan in, moving it, disposing it when we're done. But also having a system that allows you to print just compliant secondary labels from all addresses. It shows the doc. It's got appropriate safety data, the grams, the signal words, the phrases. It's got the information on it. That's great. But once it gets into the lab, if I dispense from that primary container to a secondary container, and the intention for that container is that it will be here a while, might want to print a hazard label, affix it to it. So I need to be able to print these type of labels. These are all examples of just different styles of labels that are printed from the Biovia system. Labels I'd make, we see that there's a lot of information manufacturers are required, it's a big requirement to track all the information, and inventory ranges in size. You might have really small containers, really large containers. You can put, the SDS for more information. There's some key things that you could put in there. We've supported everything down from a 1/2 inch label by 3/4 inch wide, so a really small label, all the way up to 4 by 6 inch labels for 55-gallon drums. Or produce PDF bigger ones if you needed to. But there's a flexibility there, and we can always share more details about the labeling. But when it comes to ensuring compliance, one of the things we would suggest today, if it was my opportunity to sit down and talk to people, would be to look at what you're currently doing. A lot of change is scary, nobody wants to do it, but see what you're doing, see if it's the best way, see if it allows you to track the new information, the new hazards, the new categories. And I don't know if you can see here, it's kind of a small screenshot, but it's just a system that allows you to go label codes, the grids, the content, the pictograms, the signal words. It's a lot of information. So it allows you to put that there. It's very hard to make one up. I don't want to put that in an Excel spreadsheet columns, copy and paste it or handwrite it into a log. Find a solution that allows you to manage of sources that have content. And the reason I mention that is because every call I'm on, every potential customer I talk to, even existing customers that are looking at how do I do this, how do I come up to speed with GHS, they're looking for automatic content. Where do I get the content from? Well, unfortunately, as the different manufacturers are going out today, capture this information, there's not a ready source to do so. Biovia has already went out and started collecting the information. So they went to your Stigmas, your Acris Organics, your Fish Scientific. They're actually going to start collecting that content. So a resource called ACD, which stands for the Available Chemicals Directory, that has over 15 million products in it. The goal is to help streamline the capture of that data and get it directly from the manufacturer, so that from a use perspective, if I own material, we're going to receive it in, I can source that information from ACD, hit the import button, and have it help generate a lot of this information, so it's not going to be a hugely new process. I have a thing here too, just on the left-hand side, again, I know it's small, but we'll be able to distribute these slides. The ability to distinguish, as we move forward, as you're looking at your inventory and trying to understand what needs an update, have we received one from the manufacturer, how do I get one, have a way to differentiate between the OSHA format and the GHS format. So that's one of the default fields we have in the system, so that from a perspective, if I'm one of those people trying to manage this, I can have just a simple report that tells me these are all the ones that are still in OSHA format. So I have a work list. I'm working on the things that need work, not the ones that have already been updated. In addition to that, think about how you identify the fact that you haven't got one. So if working diligently through my list, look to see if there's a new version out there. You might want to reach out and contact the manufacturer. Can I get an updated document? If they have one, they cannot provide you one, document that. On this date, contact this manufacturer. That way you're covered. You can always go back, but just like a person that uses chemicals in a lab, there's manufacturers that use different components in their materials, and they're still waiting for the manufacturers of their components to come out with these new SDSs. There is going to be lag time. There's going to be documents that aren't readily available by June 1st, but there are a lot of people that have to accomplish a lot of things in order to make this happen. In terms of this pro, it's high level. The goal is to have a building block of chemical inventory. So from a logistics standpoint, if I was to chop off all the regulatory content, we want to know barcoding. How many containers do we have? Where are they located? Who's responsible for them? When do we receive them? When do we dispose of them? When are they going to expire? Basic information. But on top of that, by integrating those two together, you can see all the unique products we have. Whether I have one container in one lab or 100 containers across 10 different sites, I have one record. I have one SDS to maintain, but I can see how much inventory I have and where, people need to have access to that document. And you can track other things. So over time, people have talked about the ability to not just track SDSs, but handling SOPs, disposal processes, technical data sheets, certificates of analysis, all the other things that go along with chemical inventory you can also incorporate in. And then, of course, one of the big things in addition to GHS is regulatory compliance. So being able to have this of what SysPro is the tracking of inventory. But on top of that, if you know what your inventory is, you can ensure compliance with OSHA, the GHS. You can also ensure that you know which materials you have are reported to different regulatory agencies like Department of Homeland Security. Here in California, we've got Prop 65, meaning where those materials are, who's being exposed to them. You've got FBI list, you've got DA list, you've got highly hazardous materials list. All things can be associated, so with your inventory, you know what's reportable. You have direct ways to know when you need to follow up with SDSs. You can document when you contact them, and it's all in one tiny package. It's one simple system. And of course, if I'm going to that previous slide, instead of having each person doing this, wasting time, which essentially means wasting money, if we centralize it, if we find a solution that can meet the needs of all these different things and everybody can access it, then you have one simple place to manage the safety data sheet. Everybody accesses it. It only has to be updated once, which of course leads to a savings of time, savings of money. And by, what is it? It is a real-time chemical inventory system. We talk about chemicals first and foremost because that's why the system was designed originally over 20 years ago, but it has been expanded to include other things like biologicals, supply of even, equipment. The point is the tractors, seats, disposables have that real-time inventory. It's a user-friendly interface. It's multi-site, so you can use it all the same information, create it once, across different regions around the world, and it even supports multi-jurisdictions. So if I'm here in the U.S., I put my GHS information in, I can use that information. If someone in another site in their country manages the same material, but they have different GHS content, they can also just set up a different jurisdiction and have the appropriate GHS classifications there. SDS Management Association, Regulatory List Association, report email notifications. So it provides a lot of different features and products within the application itself. And then this system has been successful for so many years is because it allows for multiple different printing options. In the last year, we've adopted color printing in addition to black and white. So the majority of inventory still just requires the barcode label, the inventory label. But so adding on top of that for all of our customers to be able to ensure compliance with GHS, we now support color printing to include that diamond around the appropriate GHS pictograms. And of course, it comes down to being able to simplify, being able to use quick scanners and rote intrinsically safe scanners, and even smart devices to manage that inventory, easy access base, available from anywhere so that you're efficient, you can access the data that you need, and it's all done very simply. All comes down to just a quick summary. What we've seen over time is that if you can integrate container inventory, so the basics of logistics with classification, then you can be in compliance. You can put those two things together, build it once, use it many. When you then take that inventory and integrate it with SDS management, you're then meeting the second level of compliance. You have your inventory, we know how much, we know what the classifications are, hazards. We integrate safety data sheets so that we're simplifying, making people more efficient, making sure they have access to that data, and streamlining it and automating it as much as possible. Because chemical inventory management, as I stated before, it's one of the hardest things. It's a hard sale. It's a hard thing for people to grasp that they need to do this, that they want to do this, that it'll actually, even though it seems like a change and it's going to be hard, it actually makes you more efficient. People are to access inventory. They can access the safety information. They can print secondary labels. They can share resources. And of course, if you look forward, now is a really good time to plan. We know that changes are coming that affect not only manufacturers, but the transport of materials, the use and the disposal of chemicals. It's really a beneficial time to look at the changes that are coming and understand really how they affect your organization. Because with all the people online now, every organization is different. How it affects you is going to be different. So it's a case-by-case basis, but understanding the regulation and understanding your inventory take the next step farther. So look forward, look at what's coming, look at what you could do today to ensure that you can be in compliance as the regulation changes. And if the design of all of this comes down to, if you have an accurate inventory, you're able to streamline your workflows in terms of data management, get rid of dark data, put visibility, give easy access, and be very successful in the changes that come with adoption of GHS. We went ahead and did just a quick poll. So in case we've shared information, I did see a quick question, question about slides. We will provide those slides out to you. We can also provide a recording of the presentation. We can provide you more information about how Biovia as an organization helps ensure compliance, as well as we can always demonstrate our product and how it works and how it helps streamline the adoption process. So feel free to take a minute and fill out additional information if you'd like us to contact you. We can do that. And at the time, I'd also like to open up the floor for questions. But that poll will be there. You can answer it at your leisure over the next few minutes. At this point, I would like to open up the floor for questions.
Okay, so this is Ed Rakowski, Managing Editor of Periodicals at AIHA. Thanks to everyone for participating in today's rebroadcast. It looks like we have about 30 minutes or so for questions. There are a lot in the chat queue, so I'll start there and we'll get to as many as we can. And I'm just going to read these out. Ann and Denise and whoever wants to take them, just play it in. Here's a question from a Gary. I have heard that an employer must have SDSs, not just prior MSDSs, on even for chemicals that were purchased prior to these requirements. Your understanding, even the chemicals are now gone, or does it only apply if they're still in one's inventory?
I'll speak to that. This is Denise. There is no requirement there's no requirement for a manufacturer or importer to create a new safety data sheet, as Ann said during the presentation, if they no longer manufacture that chemical. So you may have products on your inventory, products in your plant that there are no new safety data sheets available for, and you need to just document the fact that you requested them and that was the response, and you would retain the old safety data sheet or MSDS that you had prior to that to provide for your hazard communication information, or as as need to fulfill whatever needs you may have until that chemical is no longer at your site.
Thanks. Another question from Sandra. I have not received SDS from the manufacturer of the chemicals that my company purchases. Are they required by OSHA to send SDS to my company on June 1st, 2015?
The regulation is written is that a manufacturer or importer has to send you the safety data sheet with the next shipment after the data sheet is updated. So assuming you have, have been purchasing this product all along, they're under no obligation to actually send it to you on June 1st. They're obliged to send it to you with the next shipment or prior to the next shipment. Now, the regulation does require that they provide a safety data sheet to you on request. So if you on June 2nd or June 1st want to request the safety data sheet, not wait for that next shipment, then you can certainly do that, and they would be obliged to provide that to you. I will warn everyone on the call that not every manufacturers are not going to be done on June 1st. A lot of very complicated reasons that OSHA understands, and they have issued an enforcement policy that's on their website that you can look to, because they understand that having all the substances and all the mixtures and everything having to be done on the same date, that in some circumstances a manufacturer may be waiting on critical information for them to complete that safety data sheet. And it's not available. Their supplier won't have it for them maybe till May or till June 1st. In that case, they can't really produce the new safety data sheet because that key piece of information is missing. So, and their understanding of that is decided to have an enforcement in policy that if they can document efforts, good faith efforts to the classification on their own or to obtain the information from their supplier, and they cannot get that information until later, that there's a delay in enforcement anyway of 6 months from the time that that information is received to the completion of the new safety data sheet and label. So I actually ask for one on June 1st, and a supplier might not be able to provide it for you.
Thank you. Another question from Sandra. Assuming that training on labels and SDS was provided by December 1st, 2013, what additional training must be provided to employees by June 1st, 2015, and how about June 2016? Well,
The regulation says that the deadline, the final deadline in the HAZCOM standard is 1st, 2016. And by that date, employers, and this is only an employer date, to update their signage, because some of the substance-specific standards had new signage requirements to be consistent with the GHS. So if you use a chemical covered by a substance-specific standard, you should be checking to see what those changed requirements are. And then also for any changes to your internal hazard communication program and additional training that's necessary because of new hazards that are come about because of change in the classifications under the GHS. So that thing then needs to be done at your site by June 1st, 2016. There isn't any requirement for employers to update their training by June 1st, 2015. My only suggestion to you would be to be cognizant of the fact that if some new hazard is introduced because of a classification issue that comes around because of the changes in cutoffs for mixtures and various other things that are happening with the new regulation, that you may want to go ahead and do some training for those workers for that deadline, just because there are questions, to make sure they understand the hazard information.
I think this is a question for you. Will the Biovia system interface with other suppliers' LIMS?
So the Biovia program that we're talking about in this webinar is built with the architecture in place for APIs and web services to integrate with other programs like LIMS, and we do have experience integrating with other programs, so we just need to know specifically what you're looking for, the purposes, and it's definitely something we can explore and have done in the past.
Gary asks, what about inventory not being replaced? Do we have to track down the SDS for those chemicals even if we don't purchase more after June?
You don't need to track down the safety data sheet or the new safety data sheets for those chemical conditions.
Okay. Do keep retired SDS, MSDS for materials and chemicals used for 10 years?
There was really never a 10-year requirement to retain safety data sheets. In 1910-20, which is I don't even remember the name of the standard. I'm sure that one of our, if you look in your chat box, there's a link to an OSHA interpretive letter about the role of safety data sheets or MSDSs as exposure records. Exposure records have to be retained for the duration of employment plus 30 years. Under some circumstances, an MSDS could be considered an exposure records, but there are other records that you can also maintain or retain to meet those obligations. So you probably want to take a look at that letter of interpretation.
Okay. Gary asks, why did the compliance end date change from July 1st to June 1st?
Didn't. The original regulation was issued with the same dates that are then there since the standard was published in 2012. So not quite sure. Perhaps that was just some misinformation.
And here's another one for you. How does your system handle mixtures in the lab where label is required and bridging principles must be employed? For example, a buffer solution or HPLC mobile phase.
The this that we're talking about allows you to define any number of materials, whether it's partially available, if it's a solution, something you're creating in-house, regardless if you define the material in the application and you set the appropriate classifications for GHS, you're able to print labels for a material that you have set up and defined.
Okay. Comments. There was a mentioned need to print color labels at the site for containers. Not see OSHA requirement to use new labels for in-plant transfer containers, just a hazard warning with name. I'm not sure if either of you want to comment on that.
Well, comment first, and then maybe if we can see if there's other comments that come up. But OSHA, yes, you are correct that OSHA, the standard allows a lot of flexibility for your in-plant labeling or secondary container labeling. And in those circumstances, you can use the GHS pictograms with black borders rather than red. You can use alternative labeling systems like HMIS or NFPA. You can have different labeling system that you've developed all yourself. So any of those things are allowed. Remember, the language in the standard says that you can have the product identifier, and that's always key. You must have the product identifier that then you could link back to the safety data sheet and any combinations of words, pictures, whatever that communicate hazards and that workers are trained to understand. So I would agree, though that's not to say that I don't think color labels are great. I do think they're eye-catching. I think they communicate very well. It reminds people of the hazard. So I think the color is great. I don't mean to make it sound like I'm not a big proponent of it, because I am. But I do recognize that the regulation does not require that.
Okay, Denise. A question from Melissa. I have had many clients complain about the requirement about training so far in advance of program implementation, such as new SDSs. Is a logical answer I can provide on reasoning?
Because OSHA actually addressed that in their preamble to the standard when it was published back in 2012. Which seems so sort of time ago. And the reason they wanted to have people do the label or the training early is because they really felt that the process of getting safety data sheets and new labels in the workplace was going to take place much faster than it has. So they were concerned that workers would see a lot of these labels and they wouldn't understand them, and they wanted to make sure that wouldn't occur. As it's turned out, that process has taken a lot longer than anticipated, and that a lot of people anticipated. And so I think, now it's probably it might be to retrain your workers, because I think that we're going to see a very compressed period for all of that information to come flying in at the same time.
Okay, and we are right up against the 2 o'clock end time. I'm going to try and sneak one more question in here. There's a question from David. Is it possible that current materials classified as combustible may now be classified as flammable in the new GHS system? Yes, how will GHS view material storage in these situations?
I'll just a quick answer to that, and that is the GHS, of course, doesn't anything to do with flammable liquid storage, but OSHA did change the flammable and combustible liquid standard to address these issues, and they put in hard flashpoint stops for the various storage situations, so that they're consistent with what you've done in the past and with the NFPA classification system for flammable and combustible liquids. So if you go back to that updated version of those standards, you'll see where those changes are in there to accommodate the change in classification to flammable liquid, maintaining the pre-existing storage requirements.
Okay, and unfortunately we're out of time. My thanks to Ann Sefried and Denese Deeds for serving on the panel today, to Biovia for sponsoring this webinar, and to all of our listeners for tuning in today. Be on the lookout for notices about other upcoming Synergist webinars, and have a good day.